As 1943 drew to a close, intelligence analysts within the Imperial Japanese Army's General Staff Second Bureau finalized a report that would later be recognized as one of history's most disastrous miscalculations. Their December assessment projected the United States Navy's end-of-month strength at roughly 13,070 commissioned officers alongside 296,000 enlisted sailors. These figures emerged from methodical scrutiny of America's peacetime naval infrastructure, observable recruitment trends, and documented training capabilities. Japanese reconnaissance had achieved remarkable precision tracking American shipyard activity. Intelligence officers maintained accurate counts of carrier construction schedules, destroyer commissioning dates, and submarine production pipelines. Their analysts understood the hardware dimension of American naval expansion with impressive clarity. Yet they remained catastrophically blind to a far more critical variable: the sheer number of human beings actually crewing those vessels. Reality painted a starkly different picture. December 1943 found the United States Navy commanding 219,279 commissioned officers, an additional 120,472 officer candidates progressing through training pipelines, and 2,343,343 enlisted personnel. The total approached 2.4 million individuals under naval command. Against Japan's estimate of 309,000, this represented an error ratio of approximately 7.6 to 1. Japanese strategic planners had constructed their entire operational framework around facing an American fleet perhaps double their own in personnel strength. The truth proved far grimmer. They confronted a naval force with sevenfold the manpower they'd anticipated. This single intelligence blindness corrupted every subsequent calculation regarding American logistics sustainability, operational tempo maintenance, and casualty replacement capacity. The roots of this miscalculation traced to profound cultural oversights. Major General Okamoto commanded the Army General Staff Second Bureau when Pacific hostilities commenced, presiding over an intelligence apparatus consisting merely of 20 officers and 20 enlisted personnel tasked with analyzing foreign military capabilities. Soviet forces had consumed their primary analytical attention. Perhaps 2 or 3 officers devoted themselves to aerial intelligence matters. The Army War College provided minimal instruction in intelligence methodology. Japanese military tradition celebrated combat prowess and tactical excellence above all else. Intelligence work occupied secondary status, frequently becoming the assignment for mediocre performers rather than the most capable officers. This institutional weakness meant that when comprehensive analysis of American industrial mobilization became critical, Japan possessed neither adequate personnel nor sufficient expertise. Pre-war Japanese intelligence efforts had indeed examined American and British naval forces extensively, yet these studies fixated almost exclusively on tactical doctrines, vessel engineering specifications, and fleet organizational structures. Nobody of consequence investigated Western shipyard expansion capabilities, large-scale crew recruitment systems, or training infrastructure development. The possibility that America might fundamentally revolutionize its military personnel development approach simply never penetrated Japanese strategic consciousness. A Japanese journalist observed in 1943 that his nation proved utterly incapable of achieving objective distance to positively assess the emotional frameworks and cognitive patterns of foreign societies. This cultural constraint permeated the intelligence services completely. Initial concrete evidence contradicting personnel projections emerged from battlefield encounters rather than intelligence analysis. When the Guadalcanal campaign began in August 1942, Japanese forces initially calculated American Marine strength on the island at 2,000 troops. They considered it inconceivable that the landing represented anything beyond reconnaissance in force. Combat operations revealed over 10,000 Americans present on Guadalcanal. Subsequently, Japanese estimates placed 10,000 Americans on the island when actual strength reached 23,000. This pattern replicated itself throughout Pacific operations. Japanese Army intelligence estimated General Douglas MacArthur's Bataan force at 25,000 when the actual number approached 80,000. British forces in Singapore were calculated at 30,000 against an actual strength of 85,000. The Midway garrison was assessed at 750 personnel and 60 aircraft, when reality showed 3,027 personnel and 121 combat aircraft. These tactical intelligence failures should have triggered comprehensive reassessment of American military capacity. They didn't. Japanese command architecture remained fragmented. The Army General Staff, Naval General Staff, and Imperial General Headquarters operated with substantial autonomy. Intelligence sharing between services proved ineffective. More critically, intelligence contradicting operational preferences faced dismissal or disregard. Japanese military culture during this period offered no rewards for officers delivering unwelcome assessments. Emphasis fell upon fighting spirit, tactical mastery, and offensive operations, suggesting the enemy possessed far greater strength than estimated carried implications of defeatism. What Japanese intelligence completely overlooked was the extraordinary scale of American training infrastructure development. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States Navy maintained approximately 6,000 recruits undergoing training at Naval Station Great Lakes near Chicago, Illinois. This solitary installation, constructed along Lake Michigan's shores hundreds of miles from any ocean, would transform into the primary production facility for American sailors. 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Great Lakes housed 68,000 recruits simultaneously undergoing training. By September 1942, that figure exceeded 100,000. The installation expanded to encompass 1,600 acres. Over 700 instructors operated continuous training cycles. Between Pearl Harbor and Japan's August 1945 surrender, Naval Station Great Lakes alone processed over 1 million sailors through its programs. That single facility trained more personnel than the entire Japanese Navy fielded at peak strength. Japanese reconnaissance never detected this expansion. Great Lakes occupied the American interior, beyond any coastal areas Japanese aircraft could reach. Intelligence officers knew of the facility's existence from pre-war documentation, but possessed no capability to observe its massive wartime transformation. Their projections relied on the facility's pre-war capacity, designed for perhaps 20,000 maximum occupancy. They lacked any conceptual framework for understanding that Americans would construct temporary structures, convert civilian buildings, and operate multiple shifts to achieve 5 times design capacity. Great Lakes represented merely the beginning. The United States Navy established 4 entirely new major training stations during wartime, each built from scratch specifically for mobilization purposes. Naval Training Station Sampson opened in New York during 1942 with capacity for 20,000 simultaneous recruits. Naval Training Station Farragut opened in Idaho's remote mountain valleys in September 1942, ultimately training nearly 300,000 sailors before its 1945 closure. Naval Training Station Bainbridge opened in Maryland during October 1942. Each installation operated at massive scale, utilizing rapid construction methodologies. Japanese intelligence remained ignorant of all these facilities. They didn't appear in pre-war records. Construction proceeded too rapidly for tracking through conventional intelligence channels. Their locations fell in areas Japan possessed no capability to observe directly. The intelligence failure extended beyond training facilities themselves. July 1943 witnessed the United States Navy launching the V-12 program, revolutionary college-based officer training system. This program operated across 131 university campuses throughout America. It accepted high school graduates and college students, placed them on active duty as apprentice seamen, provided university-level technical education, then commissioned them as officers upon graduation. Between July 1943 and June 1946, over 125,000 individuals completed the V-12 program. This single initiative produced more officers than Japanese intelligence estimated the entire American Navy possessed in total personnel. The V-12 program operated at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Notre Dame, Cornell, Northwestern, and dozens of additional universities. Students pursued engineering, navigation, communications, and foreign language studies. They inhabited dormitories converted to military barracks, attending classes alongside civilian students, while subject to military discipline. The program created a pipeline capable of producing thousands of technical specialists each semester. Japanese intelligence never detected it. They understood American universities existed and maintained some naval ROTC programs, yet possessed no conception that Americans had converted their entire higher education system into military training infrastructure. American mobilization operated on principles completely alien to Japanese military thinking. Japan had developed its navy through decades of careful cultivation. Officers attended Naval Academy for years. Technical specialists underwent extensive training regimens. Crews drilled constantly to achieve precision. Quality remained paramount. The Japanese Navy was professional, highly skilled, and extremely capable. But it remained small, and when ships sank, pilots died, or crews perished, replacement proved slow or impossible. The entire system assumed wars would be decided by the quality of forces existing at conflict commencement. America adopted the opposite philosophy. They determined that scale mattered more than individual perfection. They constructed training systems capable of processing millions. They accepted that individual sailors might prove less skilled than Japanese counterparts initially, compensating through overwhelming numbers, superior logistics, and continuous replacement capability. An American destroyer losing crew in combat could return to port, embark fresh sailors straight from training, and resume sea operations within weeks. A Japanese destroyer with similar casualties might wait months for replacements, if available at all. The Americans also solved a problem Japan never recognized existed. Most American recruits originated from inland regions, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Kansas. These individuals had never witnessed the ocean, much less served aboard vessels. The Navy constructed enormous swimming pools at installations in the country's interior to teach swimming. They built ship simulators on dry land. They created standardized training manuals that any instructor at any facility could employ. They industrialized education using the same methodologies applied to manufacturing. A recruit class at Great Lakes comprised 1,000 individuals receiving identical instruction on identical schedules using identical equipment. Upon graduation, they might not match Japanese sailors in individual skill, but there were 1,000 of them, with another 1,000 already in training behind them. By late 1943, American production of trained sailors had achieved industrial scale. Great Lakes graduated classes every few weeks. The V-12 program commissioned hundreds of new officers each semester. Specialized technical schools produced radar operators, sonar technicians, fire control specialists, and communications experts. The pipeline operated continuously and accelerated constantly. The more people America trained, the more trainers they possessed. Graduates became instructors. Officers completing technical training taught subsequent classes. The system proved self-reinforcing and grew exponentially. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to replace losses. Following the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and most highly trained flight crews aboard them. Those pilots represented years of training investment. They couldn't be quickly replaced. Japan attempted to accelerate pilot training programs, but lacked sufficient instructors, adequate aircraft, or enough fuel for training flights. Each loss compounded the problem. Fewer experienced pilots meant fewer instructors, meant lower quality training, meant higher losses. It constituted a death spiral that by late 1943 was progressing rapidly. The personnel miscalculation carried strategic consequences Japanese leadership couldn't fully comprehend. Japanese submarines operating in 1944 repeatedly reported astonishment at the volume of American logistics traffic. They would sink supply vessels, tankers, and troop transports. American convoys simply continued appearing. More ships, more supplies, more personnel. Japanese submarine commanders couldn't fathom where all the crews originated. The answer was straightforward. They had trained over 2 million, but Japan still believed they possessed only 300,000. American prisoners of war, interrogated by Japanese intelligence officers, frequently mentioned the scale of American training programs. They described bases housing 100,000 personnel, training centers processing thousands of recruits weekly, university campuses filled with uniformed naval personnel. Japanese interrogators dismissed these statements as exaggerations or propaganda. Nobody could train that many people that rapidly. It seemed impossible, except it wasn't. It was merely impossible within the framework of Japanese understanding of military organization. One documented case illustrates this disconnect perfectly. Following the Battle of Midway, Japanese forces captured several American aviators. During interrogation, these prisoners described training facilities they had attended. The scale they depicted seemed absurd to Japanese interrogators. They reported training classes with hundreds of students, facilities housing tens of thousands of personnel, training programs transforming civilian recruits into pilots or sailors within months. Japanese intelligence officers believed the prisoners were inflating numbers to deceive their captors. The notion that America could actually operate at that scale didn't conform to Japanese assumptions about military training functionality. The turning point where personnel disparity became undeniable arrived with the Marianas Campaign during June and July 1944. American forces assaulted Saipan, Tinian, and Guam with overwhelming strength. Japanese defenders on those islands reported shock at the sheer number of American troops landing. Wave after wave of landing craft, thousands of Marines, continuous naval gunfire support, air strikes that never ceased, logistics that continued flowing regardless of Japanese resistance intensity. Japanese commanders on Saipan transmitted desperate messages to Tokyo, describing the assault force as enormous beyond anything anticipated. Following the Marianas Fall, the Japanese Naval General Staff finally commissioned a comprehensive review of American military capabilities. The review, conducted in September 1944, concluded that previous estimates of American personnel strength had been significantly incorrect. Based on operational evidence, intercepted communications, and analysis of American logistics observed in combat, the review estimated United States Navy strength at approximately 1.8 to 2.2 million personnel. This stood nearly 6 times higher than estimates used since 1942. The review recommended immediate revision of all strategic plans to account for dramatically higher American personnel and logistics capacity. The recommendations were never meaningfully implemented. By September 1944, Japan had already lost the decisive battles of the Pacific War. The combined fleet had been shattered at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American submarines had devastated Japanese merchant shipping. The strategic situation was effectively hopeless. Knowing that Americans fielded 2 million sailors instead of 300,000 didn't alter the fact that Japan had already lost control of the Pacific. The intelligence failure carried consequences, but those consequences were already locked in by the time Japanese leadership acknowledged their miscalculation scope. The institutional factors causing this intelligence failure were deeply embedded in Japanese military culture. Intelligence officers were not highly valued within the military hierarchy. The most talented officers advanced to command positions or operational planning roles. Intelligence was perceived as a supporting function rather than critical capability. This meant that even when intelligence officers identified problems with estimates, they lacked institutional authority to force revisions against preferences of operational commanders who preferred believing the enemy was weaker. Additionally, Japanese military services operated with significant rivalry and limited coordination. The Army and Navy maintained separate intelligence organizations that rarely shared information effectively. Intelligence about American training capacity might have been noticed by one service, but never communicated to the other. The fragmented structure meant that even when pieces of accurate intelligence existed, they weren't assembled into a comprehensive picture that could drive strategic revision. The intelligence failure was also compounded by confirmation bias at the highest levels of Japanese command. Military planners had convinced themselves that America was fundamentally unsuited for sustained warfare. They believed American culture was too individualistic, too focused on material comfort, too divided by regional and ethnic differences to effectively mobilize for total war. Any intelligence suggesting otherwise was unconsciously filtered out as unreliable. Senior commanders saw what they wanted to see and dismissed evidence contradicting their preferred narrative. Post-war interrogations of Japanese intelligence officers by American occupation forces revealed the depth of this miscalculation. When American interrogators explained the actual scale of programs like the V-12 system or the expansion of facilities like Great Lakes, Japanese officers were genuinely shocked. Some initially refused to believe the numbers, even when presented with documentary evidence. The concept that America had trained millions of people in just a few years simply didn't fit their understanding of how military organizations functioned. One Japanese intelligence officer stated in a 1946 interrogation that if someone had told him during the war that America would field a navy of over 2 million people, he would have considered it impossible propaganda. The industrial capacity to build ships existed, but the ability to find, train, and deploy millions of sailors seemed beyond the realm of possibility. The irony is that American intelligence made the opposite mistake in some areas. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, American analysts consistently overestimated Japanese military capabilities in certain domains. They thought Japan possessed more aircraft than it did, more experienced pilots, more robust logistics. American commanders often planned operations assuming they faced a stronger enemy than actually existed. This caution probably saved lives. It meant American forces approached battles with appropriate preparation and overwhelming resources. They didn't underestimate their opponent. In Japan's case, underestimating American strength led to strategic decisions based on fantasy. By the time reality became undeniable, it was far too late to adjust course. The personnel intelligence failure had one unexpected consequence that Japanese leadership never anticipated. Because Japan believed American forces were smaller than they actually were, Japanese commanders often committed forces to battles they should have avoided. If Japanese strategic planning had accurately understood that they faced a navy 7 times larger than estimated, they might have pursued a more defensive strategy earlier. They might have recognized that decisive fleet engagements would inevitably favor an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority and unlimited replacement capacity. They might have focused on making the cost of advancing through the Pacific so high that America would seek a negotiated settlement rather than continuing offensive operations. Instead, Japanese forces repeatedly engaged American fleets in major battles throughout 1943 and 1944, suffering catastrophic losses of ships, aircraft, and irreplaceable trained personnel. Each engagement was planned based on the assumption that American strength was limited and that a decisive Japanese victory could shift the strategic balance. The reality was that every loss Japan suffered was permanent, while every loss America suffered was temporary. American logistics could replace destroyed ships within months. American training could replace lost crews within weeks. Japanese losses were simply gone, creating a cumulative deficit that grew worse with every engagement. The intelligence failure regarding American personnel also affected Japanese decisions about home defense and resource allocation. If Japanese planners had understood the actual scale of American naval power, they might have prioritized different defensive preparations. More resources might have gone to fortifying the home islands earlier in the war. More emphasis might have been placed on dispersing critical war production to reduce vulnerability to strategic bombing. More effort might have been devoted to developing weapon systems specifically suited for asymmetric defense against an overwhelming enemy. By 1945, the consequences of the personnel intelligence failure were visible in every aspect of Japan's strategic position. American task forces operated continuously across the Pacific with seemingly unlimited ships and crews. When vessels needed maintenance or refitting, replacements were available. When crews needed rest, fresh personnel rotated in. The sustained operational tempo was something Japanese forces simply couldn't match. Their fleet was limited by both the number of ships available and the number of trained crews to man them. American fleets faced neither constraint. The story of how Japan miscalculated American naval personnel strength by a factor of 7 to 1 is ultimately a story about institutional failure, cultural blind spots, and the dangers of seeing only what you want to see. Japanese intelligence organizations entered the war understaffed, undertrained, and undervalued within the military hierarchy. They focused on tactical details they understood while missing strategic realities they had no framework for comprehending. They collected data that contradicted their estimates, but lacked the institutional authority or cultural permission to force revision of comfortable assumptions. The lesson isn't that Japanese intelligence officers were incompetent. Many were highly skilled at the work they did. They tracked American ship construction with impressive accuracy. They correctly predicted American industrial output in several key areas. But they completely missed the human dimension of American mobilization. They didn't understand that America would transform its educational system into military training infrastructure. They didn't grasp that American culture, which they viewed as weak and individualistic, could mobilize millions of people for coordinated effort. They didn't anticipate that American industrial methods could be applied to producing trained personnel as effectively as they were applied to producing ships and weapons. The intelligence documents from this period that survived the war and were captured by American forces showed Japanese analysts struggling with contradictory data. They had evidence that American bases were larger than estimated. They had prisoner statements describing massive training programs. They had operational reports showing American forces deploying in greater numbers than should have been possible. All of this evidence was available. But it wasn't synthesized into a comprehensive reassessment because doing so would have required acknowledging that Japan's entire war strategy was based on fundamentally flawed premises. That kind of admission was institutionally and culturally impossible until defeat made it unavoidable. The Japanese experience with intelligence failure regarding American naval personnel offers enduring lessons about the challenges of strategic assessment. Organizations tend to reject information that contradicts preferred narratives. Cultural assumptions shape what evidence is considered credible. Institutional hierarchies determine whose analysis gets heard. And the consequence of getting it wrong when you're estimating enemy capabilities isn't just an academic error on a staff paper. It's ships sunk, battles lost, and ultimately a war that becomes unwinnable because you were fighting an enemy you never properly understood. The contrast between Japanese expectations and American reality couldn't have been starker. Where Japanese planners anticipated a modestly sized fleet constrained by training bottlenecks, they instead confronted an industrial leviathan that had successfully applied mass production principles to human beings. The assembly lines didn't just produce destroyers and carriers, they produced the sailors to crew them, the officers to command them, and the specialists to maintain them, all at a scale that defied Japanese comprehension. This wasn't merely an intelligence failure. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to understand that the rules of warfare were being rewritten by a nation that approached military problems the same way it approached civilian manufacturing challenges. America didn't try to perfect individual warriors. It built systems to produce adequate warriors in overwhelming numbers. And in modern industrialized warfare, it turned out that quantity had a quality all its own. If you found this account valuable, please take a moment to like this presentation. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.